Defending yourself and property in the state of Indiana. One of the questions that we get a lot at our law firm is, what kind of force or what can we do to defend our property? Can we walk out? Can we just shoot someone trying to get into our house? Can we walk out and launch a baseball at somebody who's trying to jump our fence? What is reasonable and what is not? And circulating Indiana right now is actually a martial art instructor was practicing his martial arts, jiu-jitsu actually, in his gym. And next to his gym is a auto parts store where they're constantly fixing cars. The martial art instructor is looking out the window and he sees somebody from the auto shop trying to get into his vehicle because his vehicle actually matched the description of the next vehicle in line to be serviced over at the auto parts store. So it leads to the unique question of what can the martial art instructor actually do? So Zach, when it comes to defending property, what does Indiana law have to say about that?
Specifically with a car, there's two different kind of ways to look at it. If you're in the vehicle and someone's trying to get in the vehicle that you're in, an occupied motor vehicle, you can use force to defend yourself in that situation. But that's not the situation we have here. He looks out the window and sees someone trying to get into his unoccupied vehicle. That's his property. He's still allowed to use some reasonable force to terminate the trespass on his property, in this case, his vehicle. So that's what he could have done. He probably would have been fine going out, pushing the person away from the vehicle, and that being the end of it. He didn't even have to do that, though. He just started banging on the window, and that stopped it right there. So that's all good right there.
Let's take the example one step further. If he sees him, and instead of pushing him, goes out and just throws a giant right hook, are we good?
It has to be reasonable. And I don't know if that's reasonable in this case, just coming out and blindside smacking someone to stop them from getting in your car. But that's a question for a jury to determine ultimately, is if that's reasonable. People don't want to get to that point though. If you can avoid that, do it at all costs, because you'd have to go through the whole process of the criminal justice system to get that answer of was it reasonable, and ultimately that's left in the jury's hands. So you're best trying to solve it in some non-violent way if possible.
And Zach, this whole situation originated because the auto parts worker believed he was getting into what was the next car in line, and you got the martial artist who believed his car was being broken into, someone tried to steal something. When it comes to defending your property, in this case a car, do you have to be right about what's actually transpiring?
Well, in this case, he was right. But it's, again, what's reasonable. So if you reasonably believe someone's breaking into your car, you don't necessarily have to be right as long as it's a reasonable belief that it was. In this case, though, he was right.
Sure. And then, obviously, one thing kind of leads to another. When words are exchanged, you see the door pop open, you see the auto part owner kind of bull rush in, and then you see just this giant fight ensue, which ultimately leads to punches being thrown, and then you have the martial artist eventually choke him out into basically what's called a chokehold. So at that point, are we still talking about just defense of property, or if we kind of jumped into a different defense?
So now this is defending yourself, and it's self-defense. And what's important here is if the person, in this case the martial arts person, reasonably believed that force was necessary to prevent serious bodily injury to himself. In this case, it's injury to himself. It can also be injury to another, but here we're talking about him. And he sees someone who he believes was just trying to break into his car, now physically coming after him in an aggressive manner. And so I think he is reasonable in believing that he needs to defend himself. Another thing that comes in self-defense is you can't create the situation that gave rise to need self-defense. And in this case, he didn't. He saw someone trying to break into his car. That's a reasonable interpretation of what he saw. And so he came and banged on the window. He didn't create that whole fact pattern, that whole situation. You can't use self-defense if I come up, hit you, and then you start fighting back and I hit you again. That's not self-defense. I can't use it then. But in this case, he didn't do anything to create this situation. He only responded to a situation in progress. And I think what he did was reasonable to stop it. Now, again, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And what's reasonable is oftentimes left up to the trier of fact to decide. In this case, the judge, if it's a bench trial, or a jury, if it's a jury trial. So I don't think that charges were ultimately filed out of this, but that reasonable standard is ultimately left up to the courts oftentimes to figure out.
Yeah, so this has been absolutely wild. This video that kind of came out, it's been circulating the news. It actually starts out as a very, very, very solid defensive property situation because You're right. He walks out. Hey, don't do that. What's going on? Obviously, we don't know the words that were exchanged. Certainly could have been a pleasant conversation, but at the same time, you've got what appears to be a misunderstanding between two people. And again, you don't have to be right about what's happening. So the martial artist doesn't have to be right about the auto owners walking in and trying to steal his property, because that doesn't look like that's the case, but it appears in his mind, his being the martial artist instructor's mind, that that's what was going on. Is it reasonable to believe somebody who's trying to stalk out a car, put a key in to try to open the door, jimmy the door? Is it possible? Is it reasonable to think someone's breaking in? Of course it is. That's, I think, what anybody reasonable would do. Even just, hey, get off my car, I think we'd be fine as far as reasonableness goes in that aspect. And then it kind of shifts from defending the property to then defending himself, because you got the situation where the words are exchanged, and then the door opens, and then the fight ensues. So then you go from property to yourself. So really, really unique aspects going on in this video here when it comes down to self-defense and defense of property. So the most important thing is, if you find yourself or anyone you know in a situation where you're in a fight, you're trying to defend yourself, you're trying to defend your property, give us a call. Self-defense cases are oftentimes come down to a very much he said, she said type situation. The beauty of it, outside, absent circumstances where there's a video, it is just testimony between two parties. So it becomes a lot more difficult for the state of Indiana when it comes down to trying to figure out exactly kind of what we're looking at as far as criminal charges. So if you or anyone you know find yourself in that situation, give us a call, 317-632-3642. And remember, always plead the fifth.